thank everybody for coming and apologize for the delay. My name is Rima Afifi. I'm with the Faculty of Health Sciences. I'm here to introduce our esteemed speaker this afternoon. In my capacity as the chair of a steering committee for a new AUB, a youth research working group that we just initiated on campus. So just to sort of situate myself, I'd like to introduce Dr. Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, who holds a BSc from the University of London in 1971 and a PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1977.
Thank you.
He's currently professor of economics at Virginia Tech and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, as well as a research associate of the Dubai Initiative, Harvard Kennedy School. He was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania from 1977 to 1984, a visiting faculty at the University of Oxford from 1991 to 1992, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute from 2007 to 2008. He served on the Board of Trustees of the Economic Research Forum from 2001 to 2006, and the Economic Research Forum is a network of Middle East economists that is based in Cairo. And he was a research fellow, he's been a research fellow there since 1993 and on the board of the Middle East Economic Association. He currently serves as the associate editor of the Middle East Development Journal and is on the editorial board for the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities. His research has been in demographic economics, energy economics, and the economics of the Middle East. He's co-authored with Jacques Cremer, The World Oil Market in 1991, and edited 2 volumes, Labor and Human Capital in the Middle East in 2001, which was recognized as a Noteworthy Book of the Year by the Princeton University Industrial Relations section, and The Production and Diffusion of Public Choice Political Economy, Reflections on the VPI Center, with Douglas Eckel and Joseph C. Pitt in 2004. His articles have appeared in a variety of journals, including the Economic Journal, the Journal of Development Economics, Health Economics, Economic Development and Cultural Change, the Journal of Economic Inequalities, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and Iranian Studies, among others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Salehi-Isfahani, who will speak today on equality of opportunity in education in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for that generous introduction and for the invitation to be here, one of my favorite campuses in the world. And I hope you will excuse me if I go through a bunch of the slides that are mostly tailored for an economics audience. I don't know if there are any economists in this audience. I've cut some of them off and I'll go fast over them, and I'll try to pretend that I am talking about more important stuff like the Arab Spring, since I'm in the presence of a sophisticated audience. But before I start, let me recognize my colleagues Nadia Belhaj Hassin and Raghi Asad, who have collaborated with me on this paper and a larger project that involves looking at inequality of opportunity in the Middle East. So this paper is inspired by the aim to understand why, when you have equal access to schooling, students are still unhappy. Lots of ways that people can be unhappy, but one of the ways that people can be unhappy is if they consider a game like education, which is like the biggest mechanism for social mobility and for personal improvement, is rigged or is unfair. So that's really the driving purpose for this research. And I want to raise 2 larger issues which are not really central to this paper, but again, it's part of my pretension that we are doing something more important than measuring inequality of opportunity in education achievement. One is about the role of state as equal opportunity provider of education and employer of the educated. That's the 2 things that the state has done, and has done it in a way that in most countries in the Middle East, in particular in Egypt or in Iran, education is competitive, is meritocratic. Public employment, for the most part, has been also meritocratic, to the point that government only employs the educated people and is not so much a family network. Those two things that the state has done, and has been the reason why people have generally accepted strong states in the Middle East, have lately stopped functioning. So I'm going to show you that whereas there is a fair degree of equality of access to schools and to the quantity of education, like years of schooling, that the quality of education is provided in an unequal way. And some of the results we find are actually quite surprising, that some of the countries, even a country like Egypt that has had free public education throughout, even university, now the system heavily favors people with means. The second issue, larger issue that this research touches on is a general proposition. It's about a general proposition that governments in general are able to provide certain type of things and not others. For example, they're very good in building roads and bridges, but they're not very good in creating human capital, softer stuff. And these are the stuff that actually are becoming important in the global economy. In education, the hard stuff is like years of schooling. So you build buildings, you bring teachers, set up the chairs on the blackboard and tests, and the system begins to work like a factory. People come in, people go out, people accumulate degrees. But what's inside people's heads, especially with respect to understanding concepts, problem solving, creativity, is something that authority, external authority, is not very good at. Because in particular, authorities have a way of removing individual incentives. And you need a more open system where people are motivated by learning, and they're rewarded if they learn rather than if they produce a diploma. So that's the larger issue, and I hope that will come also through. A little bit closer to the content of this paper, consider these differences of life chances in Egypt and Turkey. Research done by Raghi Assad shows that in Egypt, a most privileged boy has a 97% probability of pursuing higher education, compared to only a 9% probability for the most deprived boy. That's a big difference in a system that was designed for equal access. In Turkey, this is a much more broader study done by the World Bank. A girl born in a remote village to a poor family and parents with primary education, compared to a boy born to well-off parents, highly educated in an urban center in Western Turkey, is 4 times as likely to have low birth weight, 1/3 as likely to be immunized, 10 times likely to have her growth stunted, and 1 in 5 chance of completing high school, whereas the boy will likely attend college. That's where we are trying to go with this project, to understand these differences in life chances. So as a quick summary of what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the political economy of equality, and then describe the actual study, which is using test scores. These are international test scores from TIMSS, the trends in international trends in mathematics and science studies. That's what TIMSS stands for. So they have tests in math and sciences, and the scores are publicly available, including parental characteristics and a lot of other things about the environment in which these kids have studied. These are all about 14-year-olds. So these are like early youth, if you like. We want to estimate the share of family background, like parent education, and community characteristics in the inequality of scores. So scores are naturally going to be unequal. There are some able kids, some less able kids. But to what extent the inequality we observe is determined by parental characteristics and community characteristics that are beyond the control of the child and hence unfair. So what we show is that there is considerable heterogeneity in the degree of inequality of opportunity, and some countries in the Middle East have inequality of opportunities as high as we have observed in Latin America. Really one of the highest in the world, far higher than we observe in Europe. And there's no evidence of improvement in inequality of opportunity in the last 10 years or so when this data has been collected. And that's, I think, one of the purposes of doing a study like this is to make something that's hidden more transparent. That whereas we provide schools, free schools to apparently everybody, there are in every village in Iran, for example, there's a school now, a primary school, but when you look at the amount of learning that kids do, you find a lot of inequality. So first, let me talk about this political economy issue because, in the Middle East, we have a tendency to speak a lot about the Gini coefficient. Have you heard of that? Good. So that's a measure of static inequality of outcomes. And I want to show that social mobility or economic mobility can create a perception, real perception, of a more equal society, even if the outcomes at a point in time are highly unequal. So I have a very quick example for you. Consider a society which is unequal as 8 poor people and 2 rich people with these lifetime welfare levels. Look, in economics, we like to make things look simple. So a poor person has a lifetime welfare level of 1 unit, rich person 6 units. Given the composition that I just described, the Gini coefficient would be 0.4, which is the Gini coefficient you find in most Middle Eastern countries. That's about the average for the region. And if you like, by comparison, Brazil's is 0.55, Sweden is like 0.25, something like that. So that's the Gini coefficient for you. Now assume that each person is an altruistic parent and has a child. It's really important because I think we ignore when we are looking at a point in time the fact that people care about the future of their children. And that's how they judge fairness of a system. So if there's no social mobility, that means son like father, daughter like mother, you're going to get exact same Gini coefficient. You're really reproducing the old distribution of welfare. This time you get expected lifetime welfare because poor is going to become poor, rich is going to become rich. Now suppose that you have some social mobility. In the literature on equity, this is called a non-discrimination principle, which means that there are probabilities for moving up, but they're not favoring the disadvantaged. So the next thing, obviously, is going to be affirmative action. Okay? So if you do this exercise and assume these are the probabilities 0.8, so the poor are more likely to be poor, and the rich are more likely to be rich. So you get different kind of lifetime utilities. This time, things are looking better for the poor because some of their kids are going to become rich. So Gini coefficient is already dramatically falling. So if you lived in a society that had no mobility, you think it's very unequal. The same Gini coefficient, but with mobility, it feels like 0.28. It feels like Sweden. Okay? Now, if you have affirmative action, which is to basically level the playing field so the probability of being poor or rich next generation is the same, you're going to get a Gini coefficient of 0.14, which I don't know any country has that. But the idea is that mobility is really the essence of fairness in some sense. That's how people perceive and judge fairness. Equality, which is what's published in a lot of reports and newspapers like Gini coefficient, is a limiting way of looking at things. 2 countries could have the same Gini coefficient, 0.4. One could be considered fair, another one considered unfair. And recently there was some report coming that surprised Americans that Europe is more fair than the United States because the United States has always prided itself for having social mobility, even though it has inequality. Now it turns out they have both inequality and low social mobility. Europe, they have both greater equality and more social mobility, which is very significant. So let me tell you a little bit, before I get too far into this, how much time do I have?
We have until 5:30.
Okay, so
We can say like half an hour.
another half an hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
35 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So that would work. So I could go through some of these slides. I want to bring out some of the philosophical background to this. John Rawls have to be acknowledged, and his philosophy, his political philosophy, was that individuals with similar effort should face the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. So that's really the first time in 1971 in his theory of justice where this idea of equality of opportunity was more systematically explored. Romer comes about 2 decades or a decade and a half later. He translated in a way that you can actually measure it. And that's where the economic literature follows. John Romer of Yale says individuals with different circumstances beyond their control should enjoy the same advantages. And advantages in our case going to be the score you got in the test, and circumstances, education of your mother, your father, the size of the city you lived in, and number of books at home, things like that. And one more important point from my point of view, because I'm a development economist, is that Rawls wanted to define economic development or measure development by the welfare of measure the welfare of a society by the primary goods available to its worst off member. So that's where the mobility comes in. Romer says very similar thing, measure economic development with improvement in the welfare of the least advantaged type. And that's why you want to look at people's circumstances and know how they are doing. And I'm going to produce, maybe at the very end, I don't know where that particular slide is, very similar numbers to what you saw about Egypt and Turkey. What are the chances of being successful in school, meaning you're in the top 10%, depending on your circumstances? What's happening to the least advantaged? And you will see that the system really has not improved in this regard in terms of what's happening to least advantaged. So you have economic growth, which is measured by maybe average GDP or average this or average that. But if you believe in this theory of justice where the improvement of the least advantaged person should be the focus of economic and development policy, then the Middle East has not done well at all. And this study is kind of a very kind of a narrow window into that larger question. Now, it's not actually that narrow because education is a very big deal in the Middle East. You know, most of modernization is kind of defined by going to school, by succeeding in school. And parents have been telling their children for decades now that if you want to succeed, go to school. It's only lately where that message is not quite right or doesn't sound right. Go to school, you might have more unemployment. You're more likely to be unemployed than you were if you didn't go to school. So we are at this very time when there is hesitation about the value of going to school. And the most important people are the people below the median. So the value of education for the successful is still there. A lot of children who end up at AUB or go to good schools in Europe and the United States, they never have doubts about their education. What I am worried about is people below the median of income, ability, and social status. What if they give up on education? What would the world look like? And then this next point that I will go over quickly, I believe, and there's a lot of evidence for it, that the Middle East, compared to Latin America, for example, has done relatively well in providing access to schools. And you see that in average years of schooling going up, and you see that in high enrollment rates. Enrollment is in primary school near 100%, in middle school in the 80s and 90s. That is equality of access. A lot of kids are in school. And then the question is, have they delivered in terms of education quality and equality of opportunity? And there I have an answer more on the negative. Okay? This is the average years of schooling. I am measuring the average years of schooling for groups of countries. So the Arab countries in blue, and if you think of East Asian and Latin American countries as comparators, Middle East, Arab countries have actually done better. Not in terms of where they are, but in terms of the rate of growth of average years of schooling. That is quite phenomenal. Is the fastest region in the world in terms of quantity of schooling. Certainly a lot better than South Asia. And these are enrollment rates. You don't have to really look at it, take my word for it. The numbers are very high, except for a few countries. Maybe those are interesting to note. Syria, until recently, had very low enrollment rates, both female and male, in lower secondary. Lower secondary are the kids that I'm looking at. So this high enrollment is very important for my calculations because I want to make sure that the data I have, these scores, are representative of all the kids. If only the smart kids are in school, then the data set that I have is about the smart kids of Syria, not about all the Syrian kids. So in case of Syria, in 2007, the numbers are pretty good, but they're not for earlier years. 1999, the mostly able kids probably were.
What do you mean when it is higher than 100?
That's the way these are called gross enrollment rates. So they count the number of people who are in say, lower secondary school, divided by the size of the population in a particular age group. So you might have older kids or younger kids in the numerator, and that would make it go over 100. If you look at the net numbers, they are all below 100, which is to not count the students who are not in that age group. Now, if you look at education quality, the story is very different. These are the averages for the TIMSS, tests in mathematics and science. It's good to spend a couple of minutes on these. And then I have boys in this color for science, and then the girls in blue. These are science, boys and girls. These are mathematics, boys and girls. The average is about 500. None of these countries are quite there, about the average of about 60 countries that participate in this test. This is not a representative. There are almost, I think, no African countries, very few. So it's a big league. There's Chinese in there. You know, the Chinese score 600 average. They're at the very top. And that was Shanghai, by the way, not all of China. So Americans score about 550, and they're always very upset. Why are they below China? And they have all these discussions about we have to do something about our education system. Our kids aren't learning enough. But look at the Middle East. A lot of them are around 400. Many of them are below what's called an intermediate benchmark, because when you're below that, you're really not performing, right? Between 475 and 500 is pretty good. And surprisingly, the country that spent most on education in the world scores last. That's Qatar. It's the absolute lowest score. And I'll show you some more results. You will see the absolute worst are Qatari boys in the world, scoring about 270 something out of a maximum score of about 700. So you could look at this and you will see Lebanon is doing relatively well. Lebanon is also remarkable in that its boys do better than its girls, right? It's coming like this. For a lot of the countries where you see this going this way, it's the girls that are doing better than boys. It's quite remarkable when you find 14-year-old girls doing better in mathematics than boys. These are the numbers behind that, so we don't have to spend time. We may not have to spend time on this either because this is the methodology, and maybe I explain a little bit for those of you who are interested. What Romer did, he operationalized the concept that Rawls had put in verbal language. What he's saying is that if there's equality of opportunity and you have a distribution of scores, income, any welfare indicator, the distribution conditional on circumstances should be the same as the original distribution. It should make a difference whether you are looking at the distribution of scores for boys or for girls, people in small town, large town, black, white, whatever. Okay, so that's the idea, and this is actually measurable. There's a way to see if those distributions are the same. Now, this is a very easy way to look at this, and I'm going to show you some of the scores from Iran. This is a graph that's constructed to do the following thing. It's looking at one circumstance, which is gender, boy or girl, and it's looking at deciles of the scores. So these are the kids who scored at the bottom of the scale, the lowest 10% of scores. These are the winners. In any country, by age 14, if you're in the top 10% of a test on math, you end up going to university and so on. Actually, I'm very interested in this last decile because in most of these countries, it's really about that 10% who succeed. And people ignore what's happening all the way down here. And my interest is all the way here, beyond the median, below the median. Those are the people I like to understand and help and so on. Now, if you look here, being a girl was a disadvantage because the girls predominate the bottom decile, right? And the boys dominate the top decile. Now, we move forward to 1999, and then 2003, the story changes very quickly. By 2003, this is a straight line, which is to say, conditioning on gender, the distribution is the same. Okay, that was the whole idea of Romer, and it's still the same. In 2007, it's ever so slightly sloping upwards, meaning the tables turn. Now the girls are doing better. We're going to keep finding in the study that gender for almost all the countries of the region has ceased to be a circumstance of importance. If anything, it's become important, it's become advantageous to be a girl. And that raises a lot of interesting issues, especially about rich countries. Countries in the Persian Gulf are invariably where boys do not have the incentive to study, and they are falling behind. We'll see that in a moment. Let me show you more countries. This is with respect to parents' education. Whereas there is equality of opportunity with respect to gender, there is none with respect to this other important circumstance, parental education. You find that in a lot of the countries, these lines are sloping downward. In Egypt, higher education, I don't know if you can read that. This says tertiary. Tertiary education is not so important, but having parents with high school education makes a big difference. In most other countries, like in Iran, in Lebanon, tertiary schooling really is important. When you look at the top deciles, parents in Lebanon with tertiary and with secondary schooling predominate in the top level. And that's the kind of thing you'll find out. I'm also interested in countries where things dip at the very top. See Dubai, Jordan, Iran, Bahrain. This is my interpretation. Kids' education, kids' abilities and prospects for succeeding in this game where only 1 in 10 succeed is revealed by age 14 or by maybe even age 10. So only the kids at the very top begin to receive the kind of attention from their parents. Parents don't really invest. These are parents with tertiary education, but if they have a kid that's not performing, they don't really seem to do anything, like private school, private tutoring, spend time at night with them, and so on. This is a very dangerous thing when parents start acting like horse breeders. You see a smart kid, you invest, you get busy with. Society, the way I look at it, is about helping people who need help rather than helping the winners. But I think the education system that we have in most of the Middle East is really favoring the winners, and we have become accustomed to this meritocracy. We even adore it sometimes. If you ever say reduce reliance is multiple choice, teachers should work more with the kids who are behind, something that happens a lot in the United States, for example. Parents in the Middle East would say that is very unfair because the idea of equality of opportunity hasn't quite penetrated. They think of corruption as the main problem. If someone is promoted because he's the son of the school principal, that's unfair, that's terrible. But if a person is doing badly because the person lost a parent in the war, well, that's tough luck. That was a kind of a debate Iranians should have had, because when they had the 8-year war, a lot of kids who lost a parent and were disadvantaged, Iran tried to open a door for them by letting them get into university with a little easier test. And the word they use for it, sahmiyei, I don't know if it means anything in Arabic. Sah means share. Sahmiyei became a swear word in Iran. It was like favored. And they say, don't talk to him, that's a sahmiyei. And they talk about the sahmiyei kids being all trouble and they're not doing well, dragging the university down. There's no trace of an understanding of equality of opportunity, about a society moving together. Yes, you can run, you can go to top university and then get an offer from MIT and win. Good for you. Do you have a responsibility towards the other ones? No. Well, they look sometimes unwashed. Sometimes they come from traditional families. Sometimes they come from fundamentalist families. So there's a lot of ideology that gets involved all of a sudden. And these societies become dysfunctional when they are not able to address inequality of opportunity at the social level. And, obviously, I'm going a little bit beyond this thing, the data, in order to show what this kind of work can do in bringing up more important issues that it doesn't directly address. So this is some of the other countries. You see Turkey. Turkey is going to emerge as a highly opportunity unequal country. And again, you see this thing dipping as the kid approaches the winner group, which is top 10, 20%. Tunisia is like that. Saudi Arabia. Oman is going to look fairly equal, as does, in fact, Algeria. Yes, Algeria and Oman are going to appear as the two countries where there is equality of opportunity, and then maybe I'll come back to talk a little bit about that. Well, if you look at education of mother and father, you see the same thing. So this is not a fluke. It's going on in math, in science, father, mother, and several other respects. You could create the same graphs. All right. This is what you can get if you do econometric work with this. So I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to do also what is known as an inequality decomposition. What are these numbers? These are odds, or probabilities of scoring in the top 10% of the national sample for advantaged and disadvantaged students. So I've invented two people, hypothetical people. There's an advantaged person, which is a boy with college-educated parents living in a large urban center, speaks the language of the test at home. It's a brilliant little thing they inserted when they asked the kids. They said, do you speak the language of the test at home? There were 3 categories. sometimes never. So you identify minorities this way, something you never get to know in Iran. There's no data on this kind of thing except here. The computer at home, and they have books at home. They count actually the number of bookcases. It's a very nice variable, and it's very significant correlated with other things. The disadvantaged kid is rural, lives in a very small community, less than 3,000 people. Parents with primary education or less, does not speak the language of test at home, has no computer, and has 0 to 10 books at home. These are circumstances beyond the control of the child, and if you run what's known as a probit, you estimate the probability of being in the top 10% based on these circumstances and more, and then you predict the probability for this kid and this kid, you get these numbers. First, why do I take the 10%? Because of the way the educational systems in these countries are defined. If you're not in the top 10%, you are not a winner. It's not the case that a median kid has a great future. Why? Because, for example, take Turkey, or take Iran, take Syria, take Jordan, a lot of these countries. The aim of the education is to pass a central national exam, always multiple choice, to get into university. And good universities in most of these countries at most admit 10%. In fact, in Iran is 1%. If you're below the 1%, you don't get a job if you get that education. Because 1 million kids sit for these exams, and 100,000 is way too many for good universities. 10,000 is maybe the top schools. And some people even have trouble when their kid is not in the very, very, very top school. If you look at you just look at Iran, for example, is 55% probability of getting into the top 10% compared to 4%. Much, much lower. It's 11 times more. If you look at Lebanon, also very high, very different life chances for a kid to end up in the top 10% of the learning scale. Qatar, 50-0, Tunisia, and Turkey. These are the countries that are going to appear as unequal also in the calculation that I'm going to do, which is more standard. Before I show you the calculation, let me show you the raw numbers in case you're interested. These are the distribution of scores. This is a frequency distribution, and if you look at Algeria, the distribution of boys and girls are on top of each other, so there's no difference. The average is the same, lower, higher. They just have the same frequency of getting high scores, low scores, and you can see they don't get many high scores. Almost nobody gets to the average, which is 500 in Algeria. So it's a bad education system, but it's fair in that sense. You get to Bahrain, there are some that are doing quite well, but it's usually the girls. And the girls is the dotted line. And the distribution is shifted to the right. If you didn't know which country exports oil or is oil rich, you just have to look at where the dotted line is relative to it. It'll tell you. Look at Dubai. Look at Jordan. This is how I know Jordan is kind of an oil exporting economy, because I look at the scores. It's even rentier. That's right, rentier. That's right. So Kuwait is like that, and if I go down here, you see Saudi Arabia. Then you see Qatar. You see Oman, one of the worst. But there are a few countries where boys are doing better, and that's Syria, Tunisia, and I believe that's it. In every other country, they're either the same. Lebanon, that's right. Lebanon boys are doing better too, right here. So what we're going to do is measure the inequality in this distribution. It's like its variance. And then figure out how much of that inequality would disappear if everybody had the same parent, if everybody lived in the same city, and so on. Predict what their scores would be. And then you calculate the inequality in that predicted distribution. And that will be the inequality in predicted distribution. This is the inequality of the original distribution. You take the ratio and subtract it from 1. You get your inequality of opportunity index. And what's nice is that this is becoming available for more and more countries, so I can compare it to, say, Europe or Latin America. And most of this work is coming because the World Bank took John Romer seriously and started putting a lot of effort into calculating these numbers. You can do this for wages, for incomes, for expenditures. We do it for these scores because data that includes per people's earnings and their background is very rare in the Middle East. Very rare that you know how much a person earns and how much education that person's parents had, which would be many, many years ago. These are random samples, just so you know. It's very well done by an international organization that's been doing it since 1995. They go translate the textbooks, the exams. They work with local authorities to make sure the questions correspond to the textbooks and to what's taught in that country. So it's not a uniform test given to everybody, but they take care to translate the scores once they have done this mapping from the curriculum to the common test. In some ways, they try to generate a score as if everybody had taken the same test. So they have complexity, difficulty levels, and all sorts of things. The weighting system is quite complicated, and we use what they create. They create these plausible values. Those are what we create, and we use the weighting scheme that they give us. We have gender, obviously, for circumstance. We have family background, mother, father education, how often speak language at home, number of books, computer and internet. And for community, we have size of community, average school, and teacher quality. So what we do is, for the neighborhood of the kid that's defined by the survey, we measure average experience of the teacher, average class size, average education of the teacher. So we have a good sense, not exactly of the school that the kid is in, because that's endogenous, because kids who are smart end up in good schools. We are interested in quality of teachers in the community rather than in that kid's own school. So if we run those regressions and do what I said, this is what you get. This is the end result that we get. The red is the ratio of the inequality explained by these variables I just showed you. For science, blue is for math. So if you take an extreme case, would be Qatar in science, kind of an outlier. For some reason, nearly 50%, 47% of the inequality is accounted for by parental characteristics. That is a very high number. But even the numbers you see for Turkey, Dubai, Lebanon has a very high science, the second highest in science, and the third highest in math inequality. Let's see, that comes about 36% or so. To get a feel for these numbers, in Latin America, it's about the same, 30% or so. In Europe, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, they are about 10%. This number would be 10%. So if you equalized all characteristics, you only reduce the variance by 10%. So a lot of the variance is innate. That's there. You can't do anything about it. In Europe as a whole, it's about 16%. The average for Europe is 16%. And United States is about 30% as well. So the way we've measured it, and this kind of surprised us, some of the Middle Eastern countries break records in inequality of opportunity, and I wonder where that is coming from. I don't have the answer to that, so maybe you can think about why inequality would be lower than Latin America, but inequality of opportunity would be equal or perhaps even higher. Only Algeria matches the world most equal opportunity equal countries in terms of education. And I am not sure that that's a good thing. So inequality of opportunity can be achieved in two ways. It can be achieved by helping the disadvantaged reach the advantaged. That's like the Head Start program in the US, right? You help, yeah. The opposite is to take incentives away from the top so they can reach the bottom. I don't know enough about Algeria, but I wonder which category it belongs, whether it's helping the poor go up, or is it such a difficult system, so rigid, that's taken incentive away from parents who have money to go and buy private education, bring in private tutors and so on to get ahead. In fact, some of the countries that have this conjecture that inequality of opportunity is creeping in from privatization of education without attention to equality of opportunity. Because you could have private education, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you provide public education of the same quality, of the same type. You could have public tutors for if the schools are bad and kids are not learning enough and they have to go in the afternoon to a private tutor, there should be public tutors for the disadvantaged kids, or there should be vouchers given to parents so they can also hire private tutors. I would say that would be an opportunity equal policy. The reason why I think that private education has something to do with this is because the countries where private education is important, like Lebanon, like Dubai, like Turkey, like Iran, and in Egypt too, they happen to have higher inequality of opportunity compared to others.
About maybe 5 more minutes.
Yes, I'm almost done. Couple of more slides. I want to show you the contribution of these two kinds of characteristics, one being family background, the other being community. The reason why I'm interested in to separate these out, because government policy is really responsible for community characteristics. Quality of schools should not differ between big and small cities. Family background is harder to work with. That's where the vouchers come in, right? If the parents doesn't know math, to teach math to the kids, you give them a voucher so they can hire a private tutor, as if that were a substitute. So family background, again, is very high in the same countries where the share of family background is very high in the same countries I mentioned where private tutoring and private schools have become important. Turkey, Tunisia, not Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan. Private tutoring is big in Jordan. And where is Lebanon? Yes, actually in Lebanon is the community characteristics, and you know why. Lebanon, of all these countries, differences in community characteristics because the society is more sectarian, it's more divided along ethnic lines and so on, is more than, say, a country like Iran. So community characteristics are showing up in Lebanon and should not be surprising.
And community characteristics were the size of the community, and what else were the community characteristics?
The size of the community,
The teacher quality. Okay.
and average teacher and school quality, class size, and things like that. So the last thing last number I'm going to show you is how these things have changed. This is really difficult to do, but Tim's people have made efforts to make scores comparable over time. And we use that for the countries that participated. Iran participated 3 times in a row, and Turkey is twice Tunisia 3 times, Morocco, that's right, to see whether inequality of opportunity has decreased. I don't see the evidence for a decrease. Some countries have increased. If you look at Turkey, for example, it was from a European scale, went to 38.8% in 2007, from 17.6. And if you look at Jordan, it went from 27 to 25, 30. It's not a big increase, but some increase. If you look at Iran, from 20s went to 30s. Saudi Arabia went from 15 and 16 to 28 and 30. So private education, greater competitiveness of the education system has increased inequality of opportunity at the same time when Saudis have been spending millions of billions of dollars in providing schools and other amenities to people. There is still something to be done. So actually, I may just leave you with this slide because time is short and I'm very interested in hearing your opinions. These are the policy implications. Let me just repeat them a little bit. I've mentioned them as we went along. This kind of analysis is important for revealing type of inequality that's very hard to see. It's difficult to measure as well. And it's possibly more important for social discontent because it's about unfairness, not just inequality. If you think about Gini coefficient, there's no human emotion that's directly related to Gini coefficient. Well, I am this part of the distribution, somebody has more. But when you get to unfairness, when you get to inequality of opportunity, my kid is good, very smart, but can't get the same thing as the other kids, that is a human emotion, whether you want to call it envy or what, it's sense of unfairness. It also reveals specific circumstances. Size of cities, someplace important. Some places, quality of schools is important. It tells you a little bit to policymakers where the intervention should be. To level the playing field, which is the job of policymakers, is to reduce inequity through more equal access to basic services and better public education, including early childhood education. That's one of those things that most countries that are interested in inequality of opportunity take care of. A lot of life chances are determined in the first 5 years before public schools open their doors to these kids. And this last point that I made in the case of Algeria, the policy should not be to take away from people who are performing well, from parents who are investing in their kids' education, but rather it should be using public money to help the others catch up. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
My name is Adel Cortaz, former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. I have a PhD from Michigan State University as an agriculture economist.
Wow.
I was very much interested by your presentation.
Thank you.
But I wonder why you have restricted, I am ignorant in this field, please correct me, why you have considered only 2 factors for good education, math and science, while I could consider, I have been to Morocco as FAO representatives for the United Nations, and I have noticed there in Morocco that for nationalistic conditions or considerations, the Istiqlal Party wants to educate the people only in Arabic, while the French has been there for many, many years.
Right.
When they reach the university, then they need the foreign language, either French or English.
Yes, that's
French.
right.
Therefore, I consider that having another language besides its own national language is very, very important. King Hassan II used to say, I consider as illiterate the one who knows only his own language. Now I come to another point which is very, very important. The system of education is very, very important for the quality of education. I have been to Egypt also, working for FAO, and I noticed that, and by the way, the Egyptian system of education is well spread in many, many Arab countries. Memorizing, for instance, is the best way to educate people. Well, memorizing is not the best way to educate people. I want people to be educated, to be thinkers, to do some research in the future, and to think that. And I want the system of education who would allow me, or allow the masses of the population to find jobs in the future. Otherwise, if you educate people to be unemployed in the future, it would be a disaster.
Yes. Should I answer? Yes. I'm with you on everything you said about the importance of a second language, being bilingual or multilingual. I'm also with you about educating children in a more, in a wider set of skills rather than just ability to memorize things or reproduce them in a multiple choice. Writing is something that I emphasize a lot. It's a creative thing. It's an equalizing thing because a kid can express herself in writing even if she can't score very high in the math, or maybe she doesn't have a good memory, and that gives the kid confidence. You know, the more skills you develop, the more egalitarian you are. Because if you think of human beings as being born with 100 different abilities, if you just, each one may be distributed unequally, naturally. But the 100, if you add them together, it's like you're reducing inequality by just simply spreading the range of skills that you reward. About why we look at these two? Because the data. The data come this way. TIMSS only has tests for math and science, but they are, as you see, I would have thought that math and science are going to produce different outcomes because math is maybe for boys and for kind of whiz kids, and science, anybody can go memorize, you know, the chemistry formulas and so on. But you saw a very similar story emerge from math, which is more innate ability, and science, which responds more to effort, to spending time. So I think it's giving us a fairly valid window into most kind of skills, but the education system should not definitely focus on this, and this is not a way of endorsing the importance of just math and science. Should I call, or should you? Okay, so, okay, good.
Thank you, Javad. The measurement of inequality is one thing which you've done and your colleagues. The perception of inequality by the people themselves is perhaps another thing, or is there any way to measure whether the scientific measurement coincides or corresponds to how people themselves feel if they're treated well or treated badly? Because the extraordinary common denominator across much of the Arab world, and this is going back 30, 40 years. I remember doing studies in Jordan 30 years ago, where we talked to young kids in the regional, in the provinces, in the city, in Palestinian camps, in rural areas, Bedouin areas, and everybody felt that they were not given an equal chance for different reasons. Even the well-off kids felt that they were disadvantaged for that somebody else was given more opportunities because they were politically plugged in or something like that. So the self-perception of inequality, is there any way that you can measure that or find it corresponds to the actual data that you have?
That's a very good question. I am sure you can ask people to describe different types of inequality. For example, being alienated. There's some measures of polarization where basically you compare identification with a group and alienation, meaning the difference between your group and the other group. You could actually make measurements of those things. and it all has to do with, again, decomposing variances. Some of those can be done, yeah, getting closer to emotions. I'm a big believer in creating indices that correspond to human emotions, because that becomes meaningful. But you have to also remember there are emotions that I'm not sympathetic to, like envy, like take away from rich, give it to me, because I vote for you, and my demand from you is to go take his apartment and give it to me. There is, in this literature, we say there is bad inequality and there's good inequality. Inequality that creates opportunities for people to apply themselves, to show effort, and reap the benefits is very important. It should not be taken away. So when you feel there are emotions against the good inequality, then I think public policy should stand firm to oppose that. But there's also very bad inequality. If you tell an able kid that the game is rigged against you, then that kid will not apply himself. So you have a lot of able kids. It's an obvious fact that ability is distributed equally among the poor and the rich. So if you're only favoring the rich, people would say parents with university education, you're leaving a vast majority of able kids who can contribute, who should have an equal chance. So that's bad inequality. And I think what this does is, in one dimension, try to both capture an emotion, which is unfairness, and identify the kind of inequality public policy should try to remove or reduce.
Thank you, Dr. Isfahani, for a very interesting presentation. It raised more questions probably than. First, it made me raise the question of the relationship between inequality of opportunity and quality. And we could see Algeria as doing very well on inequality of opportunity, but we know about the quality of education there, so it's really a paradox. Another question which occurred to me is, I could see the increasing trend in inequality in all the countries that you have listed. Since 1999 until now, we have seen an increase in the inequality, despite increasing expenditure on education and more access and more people, and probably 100% enrollment rate and so on. So this is really strange to have this increasing inequality in nearly all the countries, despite the improved enrollment and the improved access and all of that. And also what puzzled me was, Lebanon and Jordan nearly equally well on the TIMSS, more or less. Lebanon is doing better in math, Jordan better in science and so on. But I could see when regarding inequality that they are reversed. Lebanon has the family background is low, while Jordan has the highest, I think, in family influence, while Lebanon has highest on community. I'm really puzzled by this, although we do have quite similar circumstances, and we're doing quite equally similarly on the TIMSS, more or less. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. In terms of, just take the last part of your question, comparing Jordan and Morocco, Lebanon is very interesting, because Jordan is kind of a small country, fairly homogeneous. That's my understanding. And it's rich enough that it's been able to provide schools everywhere. There is not the kind of diversity, ethnic diversity, that you get in Lebanon and in neighborhoods. So I think that's what it is doing. The ratios is one thing, and then the actual inequality of opportunity is another. Jordan, in terms of math, for example, is more below the median for this region, whereas Lebanon is at the very top. Despite the fact that in terms of parental characteristics, Lebanon is doing sort of better. But I think this is reflecting pretty much what I expected. Turkey, for example, has a very different east and west. The Kurdish minority, if you go to eastern Turkey, If you look at the statistics in Turkey and Iran, and I've done some other work comparing the two countries, Iran is a more homogeneous country than Turkey. The Kurdish areas of Iran don't do as badly in terms of services, in terms of even education, than Kurdish areas in Turkey. So Turkey is a more advanced country than Iran, but in terms of inequality of opportunity is doing worse, mostly because of these regional differences. Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering about why the trends in mathematics and science study has been used as the main indicator for the quality of education. Is that for lack of other data, or is it out of the belief that TIMSS is indeed the best indicator for the quality of education in the region? And my second question is, if we were not to look at TIMSS, what indicators would you look at to really assess the quality of education, and how would you define equality of opportunity in education?
That's a very good question. The answer to your first question is the former. We pick it up because it's there. Okay? At some level, all researchers are a slave of data. We are, in fact, very lucky. I was very excited that this data existed. I did not know it existed since 1995, that there was something about Iran I could have learned. My work is mainly on Iran. Been working for maybe 20 years, did not know it exists. So I was very excited that you had a window into the country through these TIMSS scores. You know, it's maybe not the best indicator, but these indicators are all very correlated. So if I had a better indicator, it may not tell a different story. I'd be surprised if I had a better indicator of education quality and it reversed some of these things. Like Turkey became better than Morocco or Oman. I don't think that will happen. What indicators would I think is better? You know, as an economist, I would say what you get for it in the labor market. I would like to, obviously education does many things for people. A lot of it cannot be measured. People become better citizens, better parents, but one of the main benefits of education is what employers give you. And I would love to have data. We have it for two countries, Egypt and Jordan. And the Egypt case has been studied. We have wages, we have earnings, and we have parental characteristics and community characteristics. What we don't have, unfortunately, is income from self-employment in the case of Jordan and Egypt, where the data exists, or from other types of income. So we have just people who work for wage. So you could decompose that, and what we find out again in the case of Egypt, we find that 30%. We find 30% of the variance in wages wage earners have comes from who their parents are and where they grew up, not from their ability. I think that's a better indicator because, in terms of science, for example, I believe that science is taught very badly in some of the countries I know because people just memorize the questions. And I wouldn't say that's high education quality. And by the way, every time you think about education quality in terms of scores, you have to realize there are two ways of raising scores. One is generate fear among the students. The other is to encourage them. And these two have opposite effect on productivity later in life. If you take away self-confidence by telling a kid that unless you do well, you will die, you will be terrible, you won't get good job, and you'll be impoverished. At the very time, space in life when this kid is supposed to be thinking that I am somebody, I can do things, you're telling her you're a nobody unless the test proves otherwise. It's a terrible way to educate people. But the score will go up if you really scare the kids. They might study more and so on. So I look at these scores with all that ambivalence that comes from that. Thank you for the question.
Hi, it's not really a question, it's a comment about how to take this data further. You've started by saying that, talking about the role of the state and that governments are not good at building human capital. And I think especially in the region, we have inequality of opportunity, we have problem in access, and we have problem in quality as well. There are differences between the countries, but in the whole region, it's obvious that we have these problems. So in my opinion, we cannot wait for the governments. And as the financial elite, if I might say, I started through corporate social responsibility in working with the communities. I think the cultural elite, and there is a role here for universities and other institutions to start working really towards bridging the gaps, towards improving what the problems that we have. That's really what I wanted to say. Because
Thank you.
if with the Arab Spring and everything around, if we are to wait for the governments, and you know that change through education takes a lot of time, we're in trouble.
No, I thank you for that comment. It takes me in a direction that I'm tempted to go, which is to talk about determinants of education quality and so on, which I was talking about a minute ago. But I want to come back to the gist of this talk, which is not so much about education quality. It was sort of a byproduct of what I was talking about. It was about something else, about equality of opportunity, about everyone having a chance. If there is, shared growth, if you create an improvement. One of the things that you can do, for example, is to allow private schools, right? And that could be a good thing in terms of raising quality, because you say maybe public schools, public teachers don't have the incentives, and private teachers will do better. But at the same time, you might be raising inequality of opportunity. So I want to make sure that if you are having a policy intervention that is for improving quality, it's for everybody. And the reason why that's important, especially with quality, is because, again, states, governments are very good in providing access to things like roads, electricity, A dictator can say, I want railroads here. I want a road there. I want electricity here. I want a health house here. I want vaccination. There's a level of development, a stage of development where strong states actually perform well. Then you get to a point, you say, I want creative kids. And this is where I think the failure is. So I'm going back to this quality story, right? So you say, well, we have too many kids, we can't grade writing, we can't actually do history anymore. In Iran, if you look at the what's the content of the national test, which is the object of desire, there's no writing, there's no history, there's no geography. Lots of important topics are taken out. It's math and sciences, and foreign languages, and some religious education. That's what's in the multiple choice tests. And in a way, you think you're creating equality of opportunity because the computer treats everybody the same, but at the same time, you are both lowering the quality of education and taking the parents out. How would a central authority, a dictator, be able to get writing? It's very hard, because if it's the parents who have to look at the kids' writing and drawings and so on, the state can't dictate to parents, from now on, I want you to have your kids write, do drawings, and I want you to be very nice with them and encourage them, and that's not going to work. So you need to pull back as the state, and you have to admit that education is now going to take place in the society outside your sphere of authority. Your job is to bring the basic services and build the schools, but the job of incentives for the teacher and for the parent, and all that is outside. These are people whom you can hire and fire, but it's very difficult to get a good teacher under fear that you're going to get fired to become a good teacher. And obviously you can't fire the parents. So the limits of the central authority is exactly where you go from quantity of education, from spreading the quantity to create quality education. So you need to think about how you make decentralized. That's the policy implication. And also be always careful that as you're moving from quantity to quality, that you take everyone with you. that you don't lose half the population.
Maybe the last question. Is there time? Yes.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was very clearly presented.
Thank you.
I just have two questions. One, I was wondering if we can explain the effect of community characteristics that's so high in Lebanon that is affecting inequality, to the fact that we have a lot of regional disparities in Lebanon, rural versus urban, for example. If you're looking at the community influence on opportunities of education based on the quality of the teaching in the teaching staff in your community and so on. There's a lot of disparities when you go from the urban centers like Beirut, Saida, Tripoli, and Akkar, for example, in the rural areas. You have very different levels of quality of teaching staff, different diplomas. I mean, the more you are in the urban areas, you have teachers in public sectors who have high diplomas from AUB, from LAU, and so on, sometimes masters. And as you go out into some of the rural communities, your public school teachers don't have such high background. So I wonder if this is what we're seeing in the Lebanon.
I think so. I mean, you know a lot more about Lebanon than I do, but my impression is that kind of diversity in terms of availability.
Regional disparities.
Yeah, regional disparities explain that a lot. Yeah.
Another thing I wanted just to ask you about TIMS. In the TIMS test, are we just testing content, or is there are some of the questions geared towards higher order critical thinking and problem solving? Because that's, again, something we're not teaching in the public sector in the Middle East enough. I mean, in terms of quality of education, you know, this idea that the former Minister of Agriculture was saying, you know, this idea of the traditional system of rote memorization, there's not as much emphasis on critical thinking, problem solving, and so on. Are the test questions in TIMS asking or demanding that children think in this way, and therefore is that why we're performing so poorly compared to other countries, or are they just really facts, you know, I don't know the tests, so I'm not sure.
I've looked at some of them. They're certainly better than the tests that the schools in these countries administer normally, which are multiple choice and have a lot to do with memorization. These questions are designed to measure understanding of concepts. And I forget these benchmarks that they have, 500 and the 475 and so on. They have statements associated with them like understands concepts but can't apply them, understands concepts and can't apply them. So they have clever questions about math and science where a kid would have to go beyond memorization. Yeah.
I'm sorry to take the floor again, but I was really impressed by your last statement. You know, that when you were in the rural area of Iran, you didn't have the opportunity to have all the televisions and ITC equipment around you as it is now. Now, I come to this point that even when you take into consideration science and mathematics, it's not enough, you know. I have been in the third town in Lebanon, from Zahdi. I have been educated until the baccalaureate, but we didn't have any laboratory to study science. But we studied science and we passed the exam. But it's not enough if we don't have laboratories. And this I will come to this conclusion that the best investment you have in any country is education. You remember the study made by Grelicus in Chicago School of Economics.
Yes.
And he proved that the best investment the best rate of return you can ever have is in education. I take two countries, Egypt and South Korea. 30 years ago, the same GDP per person in Egypt and South Korea were the same. But look, now, what's the GDP per person in South Korea and what's the GDP per person in Egypt?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting, and we learned a lot, I think, from what you presented. Thank you for presenting. please join me in thanking Dr. Salehi.
Thank you. Thank you.